Okay. So what have we looked at now over the course of the past few chapters? Chapter 19, we looked at how you measure production, and we looked at the business cycle. In Chapter 20, we looked at prices and unemployment, and how those aspects are measured. In the past chapter, in Chapter 21, we looked very briefly at the savings market and the investment market, and how capital is basically created through savings and investment, and that the equilibrium point, the point where the downward sloping investment meets the vertical savings curve, determines the overall interest rate in the economy. Now, with the remainder 3 chapters in this part, what we're going to look at here are aspects of growth, and we're going to actually start off with long-run economic growth. So, with that as a bit of an introduction here, what I want to look at is this idea that, when Adam Smith first wrote his text, The Wealth of Nations, he was concerned with why are some countries consistently rich, like England was at the time in the late 1700s, but why are other countries persistently poor, right? And we could look at that today. Why is Africa so poor today? And if we compare that to Western Europe, or even if we compare Eastern Europe to Western Europe, right? Or even if we compare the Southern United States to the Northern United States, right? Why are some, or even the other example, why is Mexico so poor and the United States so rich, comparably speaking? So obviously economists think about this, a great deal, because when we're trying to, recommend to developing economies how they can do better, right, we want to have some answers. So, in my case, I do a lot of field work. I spend a lot of most of my summers in Mongolia. Mongolia is north of China, south of Russia. I'm sent there in part, I'm sent there with funding from the United States, to basically serve as a person who's trying to, give recommendations about how to encourage economic growth in the country. What are most of my recommendations based on? It actually goes back to an economist who's still alive to this day, Douglas North, who actually talks about institutions. While you can certainly get economic growth by having more capital and more individuals, what's almost more important are the institutions within the country. Do you have a stable set of laws? Do you have clear property rights? Do you have a consistent judicial system? Do you have an education system that's designed to educate everyone based on ability rather than their ability to pay? Do you have a system that encourages a free market? To the extent that those things do not exist, economic growth is hurt. In the case of Mongolia, it was for a consistent, for an incredibly long time, was a communist country that had more about allegiance to party and rejection of the market as the basis of the economic system. So it's much harder to encourage economic growth when that's the mindset among many individuals, right? And that the rule of law isn't as consistently applied, because it kind of matters. In the case of Mongolia, where you were, in terms of your position back from the Soviet days. Okay, so when we look at long-run economic growth, we're going to clearly look at institutions. And I looked this up, and these stats are just amazing. In the 20th century, so in the 1900s, economies have been growing at about 2.5% a year. That's what a typical economy grows at per year. That's incredibly high if we compare it to, in this case, where we have here the 19th century, so the 1800s, when it was a full percent less, between 1 and 1.5%. Or, even more amazingly, the Middle Ages, 1300 to 1800, when economies grew 2 2/10 of 1%, 0.2% annually. Could you imagine it? If we had economies today that were growing at 0.2%, politicians would be recalled, cataclysm, apocalypse now kind of situation. Our expectations have certainly increased for faster economic growth. Well, why do you want growth? You want faster economic growth in order to raise the standard of living. We all enjoy much more stuff than our parents did, and our parents have more stuff than their parents did, in part because economic growth allows successive generations to buy more stuff. Now, how is it that we get that? What was important that we saw in the previous chapter was that capital leads to economic growth. So we're basically in this chapter, what we're saying is that you not only want the right institutions, but you want to then bring that capital to the right institutions. So companies now are willing to invest in Mongolia. Mongolia, its primary thing that it has is it has a lot of mineral wealth. It has a lot of copper, some gold and other elements. Well, no country would be willing to invest money in the country if they thought that their property would be stolen or taken by the government at some point, right? So what we need here is a model that describes how capital is acquired over the long term and how that leads to economic growth. What this is called is the Solow growth model, S-O-L-O-W. This is your first true macroeconomic model. I'll stop the video here in that kind of like long lead up. And then I will, in the second part of this video, I'll start to build that Solow growth model.